Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Kilger, and I'm the managing editor of Feed and Grain magazine and host of the Feed and Grain podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today as we dive deep into the issues affecting the feed manufacturing, grain handling, and allied industries. Today's episode is brought to you by the Bin Whip from Pneumat Systems. The powerful dual impact Bin Whip removes the toughest buildup and blockages in industrial storage silos without hazardous silo entry. Learn more today at binwhip.com. In today's episode, my guest Joe Milnick, content creation expert and partner at Safety Made Simple, is here to talk about an incredibly important topic, especially with the summer we have here in the United States: heat illness prevention. We discuss the dangers of working in hot conditions, what employees and companies should do when it's hot out, and of course, tips to make sure everyone goes home safe at the end of the day. I hope you enjoy the interview. If you want to help out with the podcast and are listening to this in a podcasting app, please rate us and subscribe. If you're listening online, sign up for the Feed and Grain newsletter Industry Watch to see the newest podcasts drop and stay up to date with all the latest news from around the industry. Thank you so much for listening, and on to the show. Hi, Joe. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. As mentioned, I think this is the third time I've been on with you. I always enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, you're one of our favorites. It's always really nice to have you on. Well, we were talking a little beforehand, and you're so knowledgeable about all this stuff, and Safety Made Simple does such a great job with your programs. It's always kind of nice to be able to give people a solution to the problem we're talking about. Can you tell us, for people who might not listen to your previous episodes, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about Safety Made Simple and its mission, what it does?
Sure. I started my career in safety in 1996. I actually started in the auto industry, which is not even close to the ag world. Shortly afterward, I worked in the auto industry for 3 years. I worked for a large agribusiness company for 10 years in corporate safety. And I learned much of what I know about particularly the grain and feed industry from working at that company. In 2009, I decided to try my hand at consulting. So I started Progressive Safety Services, and primarily what we provide is program development, training, inspections, and those types of services. I spend about, nowadays maybe 30-40% of my time doing that, and the rest at Safety Made Simple. I joined Safety Made Simple in 2014. Chuck Peary, the founder, and I ran across each other while we were doing some consulting. He's a safety professional as well. And he said, I'd be interested in having you develop some online training courses. We feel there's some real opportunity in the ag sector, particularly with grain. And I said, well, that's right up my alley. So we started to develop courses in 2014 focusing on grain, and we've expanded there. I became a partner at Safety Made Simple in 2017. We are an online training provider in the ag industry. We focus primarily on ag-specific content. We've been serving the ag industry for a little over 10 years. We've got about 165 courses, a lot of different areas, ag safety, including grain, livestock, cattle feeding, general safety, construction safety, DOT, driver safety, food safety. We get into equipment maintenance and human resources as well. And I might have forgot a few things as well. So we're full spectrum is when you look at the offering itself. So we work a lot with grain elevators, co-ops, private grain companies, agronomy centers, big in the cattle feeding industry. We've got partners that are flour mills, feed mills, biofuel facilities, even construction companies as well. So we offer our courses within our learning management system at Safety Made Simple, but also many of our partners have their own learning management system, so we can kind of plug in our courses in an existing learning management system maybe that they already. As far as our mission, it's pretty simple, just like our name. Most of the people that I work with, particularly on the content side of building courses, are safety professionals. And myself and Chuck Peary, my partner, being both safety professionals, we really understand the impact that serious injuries and even fatalities can have on people, families, communities, companies. And our mission is to send people home safely, just pure and simple.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's hard when you see those stories out there and things. It always seems like a statistic until it happens at your facility and you have to have that conversation with someone's family. Then it becomes a very different thing.
Yeah, It's interesting, Steve, because when you mention statistics, we often look at these numbers and don't realize that there's a person, that number represents a person. And in some instances, I'm going to be at Convey in July to talk about a fatality during my career, and to see that number reported from OSHA, how many fatalities were that year, and I knew one of them personally. And a lot of times we look at these numbers and that escapes us, that there's a person behind that.
And I always feel that as a person who deals with this news on a daily, I mean, it's my job, right, to find out and report on this stuff. And in a way, you have to kind of take yourself out of it. But still, you look at some of these stories and it's a tragedy every time. Well, what we have you here for today, though, is it's hot. I don't know about what it's like where you are, but here in southern Wisconsin, it has been a scorcher of a summer so far. And we thought it would be a good time to kind of talk about extreme heat, how it can impact the workplace, how to keep everyone safe when it's hot out, best practices, and what you can kind of do with that sort of thing. Can you explain a little bit about just what extreme heat can do to productivity, efficiency, and of course, like some of the dangers behind it?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a question that I don't think we draw the parallel with heat safety as the productivity piece. We usually think of it as a safety piece, but there's definitely a connection with heat-related illnesses and productivity. When you think about a hot day, and I'm actually located in Ohio, but we had 2 weeks ago, we cooled down a little bit, but we were 90 plus every day. And I was out at a construction site last week and it was in the upper 90s. We move slower, things take longer, but it really beats the alternative. And the alternative is you have somebody that has a heat illness, which can include something like a heat stroke. I worked for a grain company years ago as a consultant, and they had a contractor that died of heat stroke after a long, hot day in Louisiana. And that's the alternative. So, we're going to talk about prevention strategies today, and that's really important. But on the productivity side, this loss of efficiency and productivity, there's studies out there that indicate that this will cost U.S. businesses $100 billion annually, and they expect that to increase 2 to 3-fold over the next 5 to 10 years. When you think about productivity, like, well, how does it affect? Well, obviously, we're working slower. Things take if we're taking our time, it takes a little bit longer, that kind of thing. But I had a client in a southern climate. It's probably been a year or two, and I was doing an inspection at the facility. Brand new employee. I usually start at the top of the grain elevator and work my way down. It's just kind of the way I do it. But when I got down into the tunnels, there was a guy working down there, and he was a new employee. I think maybe his first week on the job, maybe even first couple days. It's warm down there, but not as warm as it is outside. I would think, hey, you want guys cleaning basements, tunnels in hot weather. It's probably the coolest place in the facility. He was working pretty hard. I could tell that. I didn't see anything abnormal. About 2 hours later, as I'm walking to the office to just finish up, he's on his back with a bunch of employees around him. They've called 911. He's in pretty bad shape, almost like he turned white, almost having difficulty breathing. He's panicking a little bit. And we're trying to cool him down. Those guys are getting him wet towels and all that kind of thing. And they come and take him to the hospital. He ends up being okay. He's got heat exhaustion. But you think about that. I mean, now you have one employee that was sent to the hospital. You have a lot of them that they kind of took a break there for a while to deal with all of this that was going on. They had another subsequent meeting to talk about the importance of hydrating and taking breaks and all those types of things. And on top of it, they're down a worker for a few days. So you can easily see why that would affect, productivity at a facility level.
Yeah, and as someone who's gotten sick from the heat before, it sneaks up on you. Suddenly you're like, oh, I'm hot, I'm uncomfortable, and then suddenly you're there. So you mentioned heat stroke. Are there any other kind of health risks that employees might face when exposed to high temperatures? In my mind, I think of, even if it's not heat related, just the fact working in hot conditions makes you really distracted. I would imagine you would just not, it would so hard to be fully focused on your job when you are warm and you are uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Even as a safety person that does a lot of inspections out in the field, I'll tell you, when it's super cold and it's super hot, I'm probably not as effective as when I'm comfortable. And it's just reality. So when you think about, there's really four main types of heat illnesses out there, heat cramps being one of them. If you've ever played athletics or anything like that, hot summer days, athletes, that kind of thing. I used to have a problem when I was in high school. I'd cramp up in the legs, that kind of stuff in the summer during 2-a-days in football, that kind of stuff. Wasn't adequately hydrated at the time. It was extremely hot. And back then in the late 80s, early 90s, we just powered through all this stuff. Not as knowledgeable as we are today about some of these illnesses. So you got heat cramps, there's heat rash, and that's just generally triggered by sweating, excessive sweating. Then you've got heat exhaustion, which results from you're really losing a lot of water and salt through excessive sweating. So I think most people have experienced heat exhaustion, and it's probably been the headache piece of it. I had probably a mild case of heat exhaustion at a Royals game years ago. I was in Kansas City for a Safety Made Simple. We were having a meeting, so we took the whole team out to the game, and it's 98 degrees with 80-90% humidity. And here's a guy from up north. We just don't get that warm occasionally. And I'm down there, and they seem to be doing okay. And I am sweating like crazy, and I'm drinking water. And I remember on the ride home, I'm like, man, I have a headache. So I got back to the room and kind of rehydrated, rested a little bit, cooled down, ended up being okay. But those are the things that can really spiral out of control if you don't catch them or understand what the symptoms are. So we have heat exhaustion. And then the one that we are most, concerned about, the most serious thing, is heat stroke, and that can kill you. And that's really when your body can't regulate temperature anymore. You actually stop sweating, and your body you reach above your temp around 104 or more. That's when that body really doesn't, it just kind of almost freezes, doesn't sweat, doesn't address it. And that can be really dangerous, and that can actually kill people.
You say being from the north, I feel you completely, because when I visit down there in the south during the summer, you visit a feed mill or a grain elevator or something, and you go there and you talk to them, and they're fine walking around, but there's me just getting ready to die in my button-up shirt.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Steve, too, that it just humidity impacts the feels like temperature. So I remember years ago, I had back-to-back consulting weeks. I was in Dallas, Fort Worth one week, and it was July, and it's 90-some degrees with, I don't know, the humidity's like 80-90%. I mean, you walk out to your car at 6 a.m. and you're like, being from Ohio, I'm like, whoa, man, this is crazy. It was a tough day. And then the next week I'm up in Idaho, and I fly into Boise, and I'm working up there in that area, and you got a 100-degree day, but you have no humidity. You still have to make sure you're hydrating. You don't really sweat. It just evaporates so quickly. But it almost feels so much more comfortable. But it's still hot, and you kind of forget about it. You dry out very quickly. I noticed that when I was there.
Well, especially there's like a certain mode where you start to get sick, and the last thing you want to do is put something into your body. No, that's the time you need to be hydrating. Are there any specific signs or symptoms that people can be on the lookout for? You're working with a guy, you see him doing these things, and then maybe you can be like, hey, let's take a break. Let's rest up before, things get too far.
If any of the audience ever has listened to the webinars that I've provided for maybe like Grain Journal or NGFA, one of the things that I like to focus on is that it's important. We did a webinar with NGFA last week where we talked about hazardous atmospheres and confined spaces and oxygen deficiency and other toxic gases and what the symptoms of exposure are. And like heat illnesses, I think it's important for employees to understand what these symptoms are, because then they can identify them in themselves and others. Just like when I went to the Royals game, I knew that the headache was due to probably dehydration and heat exhaustion. So I knew to drink water and get in a cool spot and rest for a while, and I was fine. So if you can recognize those types of things in yourself and others, you can actually do something about it. So when you look at those symptoms, obviously things like heat cramps, that's a symptom, right? Heat rash, that's a symptom. Heat exhaustion can be headache, nausea. People will get dizzy. They'll be really sweating heavily, like I was at the Royals game. Extreme thirst, just you can't drink enough water. The serious one, as I mentioned earlier, heat stroke, you'll start to see people, they'll become confused. Some of them will lose consciousness, seizures. Those are really violent reactions. And you'll also see them that they're so warm, like I mentioned earlier, that they'll actually stop sweating. So those are the things to be kind of on the lookout with your coworkers or your employees when you're out there working at a grain elevator or feed facility. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not just workers outside. This can happen inside. The example I used was a guy working in a tunnel where I thought, like, that's not the hottest of places, probably a decent place to be working during the day, but he still had heat exhaustion.
Yeah, well, we can forget like how stuffy and humid it can get inside, right? Like it's just
Yeah, the airflow and that kind of thing. Absolutely.
it seems so important. Well, I mean, we should all be looking out for our coworkers and each other and ourselves. And heat illness and things seems like it kind of catches, well, like you said earlier, people want to power through it, right? It's kind of still thought in that category of like, oh, don't be like a weird weak guy who can't work in 94-degree weather in the humidity. So there's still kind of that stigma behind it, which is, really dangerous when, something can actually kill you if you don't address it right away.
Exactly. I work in an industry that's how it's called, like can do, will do kind of thing. We were pretty tough. And sometimes I think taking a break is looked at weakness and all that. I think we need to get past that point of it. And I think we're moving in that direction.
Yeah, especially if you're in, I mean, we work in a high, well, I don't, the people we talk to every day, we work in a very high stakes, high pressure thing where stuff's moving fast. And when you need to get stuff done, it needs to get done quickly. You need to get that train loaded. You need to get that truck unloaded. You need to get that batch made. So yeah, it can be hard to kind of take that break. Are there things that employers can do, effective strategies that they can do to kind of keep their workers safe and healthy during this?
Yeah, there are a lot of things they can do. And I'm happy to report that I've seen them doing this and taking this really seriously. And there's been a lot of efforts, particularly like through NGFA, to really promote having a heat illness prevention program and those types of things. So having a written program around this, and OSHA has a national emphasis program on heat illnesses. And so they're stopping at work sites when it's hot out and checking to see if there's water and just having a plan right up front. There are some states like California and there are some other state plan states that run their own OSHA that require this. So I just think having a plan, like what's the trigger? It feels like temperature of 80 degrees or whatever it might be. And then what are we going to do? If it gets to an extreme, 90 plus, what are we going to do at that point? So it's really having that program in place. And just the other piece is monitoring the temperature and the weather and the employees as well. So I was just knowing I was going to come on and talk to you today, Steve. I have the app on my phone, but I haven't used it lately. There's a OSHA Heat Safety Tool app that gives you the feel like temperature in your area. It asks for permission to kind of track where you're at, know your location. And you can pull that up and it'll tell you whether or not the feels like temperature is. So anything above 80 now is considered something where some action should be taken. So that just calculates the heat index, and the heat index is the feels like temperature. So I think as an employer, at the very least, if you just follow the tenet of water, rest, shade, if you don't have a formal program, that's an important thing to do. But there's a number of other strategies people can use. So all new and existing employees should be able to acclimate to weather changes like that. And you think about so new employees, maybe they're not working in an industry. They worked in an air conditioned environment like you and I do on a lot of days. We're fortunate, right? They came from that and now they're working out in this facility and it's 90 plus degrees with really high humidity. That's a shock to the system. So how do we slowly introduce them into the workplace? You talk about existing employees. So being located in Ohio, our Junes are usually, we're 78 degrees, 80 degrees. But last week we were 90, 95, close to 100, most of the week with pretty high humidity. That's a drastic change for even the people that work outside. I talked to some construction guys and they're like, yeah, this is a lot different than what we saw 2 weeks ago. We had our furnaces on when we woke up in the morning, that kind of thing. So really that just being able to acclimate to the heat. I think the postponing non-essential outdoor work, if you can do that to reduce to times when the heat index is a little bit lower, scheduling physically demanding stuff for cooler periods of the day. Can we do that really early in the morning or evening if we're working in the evening, that kind of thing? Obviously, the additional breaks on days when there's a high heat index. Most facilities now, I think, have air conditioned place where people can rest, that kind of thing. Another one that sometimes I don't know if they think about, but the use of the buddy system, avoid working alone. That's really important anytime you're working in a hazardous environment. If I were working at heights, I wouldn't want to work alone in case I fell. That I'm hanging from a harness, somebody needs to be able to get help to me, right? Or help me rescue, that piece of it. So I think not working alone, having a buddy system, or at the very least, if that's not feasible, making sure everybody has a radio and we just check on them every now and then.
Yeah, because like we said, like it's very hard when you're in the moment, when you're suffering from, well, especially like heat stroke. You're delirious at that point. There's nothing, you can't really make rational decisions to save yourself. Having that other person there is extremely important.
Yeah, the employee that I was talking about earlier, the example, he was working with somebody else and they helped him get up to the work floor and get help from there. So he was lucky. I mean, if that gets worse, we don't know if he loses consciousness or something and how long he's going to be in that location without anybody even checking on him. So I think that's important. The other piece is hydration. So I think it's important as well for employees or really anybody to understand how to hydrate. So in these extreme heat times, we really need to have the rule of thumb is like 8 ounces of water, like every 15 to 20 minutes. And drinking in these shorter intervals is really better than waiting an hour or two and then chugging down 36 ounces of water. So
They can only absorb it so fast.
exactly. And then too much water at a time isn't good either. So water really is the best thing. Sports drinks aren't bad because they do replace electrolytes or salts. But obviously, I get into locations that I'm seeing guys chugging all these energy drinks and stuff with caffeine, and just like alcohol outside of work, that those are diuretics. So you're going to be shedding water rather than keeping it in your body. So it's just important to make sure. I think as well, the other thing we forget is like when we get home at night, hydrate at night to get ready for the next day. And then, the last thing, Steve, I would say is just, get trained workers. That's really important so that they understand, like we talked about, these symptoms and then these strategies. What can you do to help yourself throughout the day?
Well, and it's been longer, hotter bouts for a while now. Every summer seems to be the hottest one on record. So it's going to be more and more common. So best time to figure this out is now. Speaking of getting some training in and stuff, it's obviously something Safety Made Simple can help with your online courses. What specific kind of topics do you think might be good for management facilities who are thinking about getting some training for their employees for heat readiness?
We offer a couple courses, but one specifically on heat illness prevention. I was actually the subject matter expert for it. When I put it together, I think the course is probably about 2 years old. I really looked at California because they have a heat illness prevention standard there, and they're the strictest. I expect when the federal OSHA at some point here is going to release a heat illness prevention standard, I think that's, in my opinion, that's going to happen, that it's going to be based off of that California standard. So when I looked at the California standard, I focused on, okay, what are the training requirements? What do they want employees to know? And really what it got into was, and we put the course together, they want them to recognize the warning signs and symptoms, the stuff that we talked about today, the types of heat illnesses. We talked about, the 4 types today, what employees can do in the event of an emergency. And we also, in our course, we cover probably a little over 10 or more strategies of what not only employees can do, but if you're a supervisor and a manager. And that's kind of what our program focuses on, is obviously the prevention piece, but we also touch on if you witness something or somebody with a heat illness, what do you do in each one of those situations? Our course is available in Spanish because we do have our partners, particularly in the southern states, have a lot of Spanish-speaking workers, but we include testing and those types of things as well.
Yeah, plus you guys do, you do courses on so many different topics. Like you said, you're up to 160 now. You're adding new ones all the time. Anything else exciting that people might want to take a look at?
We add a new course every month, and we also update an existing course. And when we update a course that's existing, it's actually an entirely new course. It's not just going in and changing a couple pictures or the animations we use or interactivity. It's completely. We've got a lot of good ones coming up. I will tell you that the one we've been getting a lot of interest in is just a couple months ago, we released a course on OSHA's grain handling standard, and I was a subject matter expert on that one as well. And we really focused on the performance goals within the grain handling standard from OSHA. What I find as a consultant is, and I don't expect supervisors and managers to read the grain handling standard and all those types of things, but I think they need to understand that there are some requirements out there from the federal government or even the state. And they also, those a lot of times will correspond with their company's requirements. So they say, oh, okay, that's why we have to do that, or that's why we do that. So we did a nice course. Again, they're 20 minutes long that gives a nice overview of all the OSHA requirements for the grain handling standard.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. I encourage everyone to check it out. There'll be a link to Safety Made Simple's website down in the description of this and in the on the website and the transcript and everything like that. But thank you so much for coming to talk to me today, Joe.
Oh, thank you, Steve. Appreciate the opportunity.
Of course, we'll have to have you on again. Harvest is coming up, so it'll be time to review some safety tips then. All right, awesome. Well, until next time, everyone, stay safe out there.